Scarborough Shoal turns into a war zone. China's brutal sea assault on the Philippines. The latest clash between Chinese and Philippine vessels near Scarborough Shoal is not an isolated incident but part of a deeply troubling pattern of Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. On Friday, the China Coast Guard used water cannons to expel a Philippine government vessel, claiming the ship had ignored repeated warnings and insistently intruded into what Beijing calls Chinese waters. This narrative, repeated by Chinese authorities, is not only misleading but represents a flagrant disregard for international law, regional stability, and the sovereign rights of neighboring states. China's acts at Scarborough Shoal are part of a bigger campaign of intimidation in the seas. Since seizing control of the shoal from the Philippines in 2012, Beijing has maintained a permanent Coast Guard presence there, steadily expanding its patrols and intercepting Philippine ships well beyond what any reasonable interpretation of sovereignty would allow. In the past 10 months alone, interactions between Chinese and Philippine law enforcement vessels around Scarborough have been observed on 121 days, with surges in confrontations in early 2025. These are not isolated defensive maneuvers. They are systematic efforts to dominate the region and bully neighboring states into submission. China's claim that its actions are professional, lawful, and justified under its own Coast Guard law is an affront to the international community. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague unequivocally rejected China's sweeping claims to the South China Sea, including Scarborough Shoal, ruling in favor of the Philippines and affirming that the area falls within Manila's Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ. Beijing's refusal to accept this legally binding decision and its continued assertion of historic rights over more than 80% of the South China Sea is a direct violation of international law and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. China's deployment of heavily reinforced Coast Guard vessels, often supported by maritime militia and naval assets, has transformed what should be peaceful waters into a zone of constant threat for Filipino fishermen and government vessels. The use of water cannons, aggressive maneuvers, and close monitoring are not standard enforcement measures. As Beijing claims, they are acts of coercion intended to deny the Philippines access to its own waters and resources. These maneuvers endanger lives and livelihoods of local people who has for years gone for fishing and sustenance in these waters. Rather than seeking diplomatic solutions or honoring past agreements to reduce tensions, China has chosen escalation. Its expanded patrols, frequent confrontations, and increasing aerial encounters including dangerous maneuvers by Chinese military helicopters and fighter jets have made the South China Sea a flashpoint for potential conflict. This reckless behavior risks not only bilateral relations with the Philippines but also broader regional security, as any miscalculation could trigger the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty and draw in outside powers. China's unilateral actions undermine the efforts of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, to maintain peace and stability in the region. Instead of engaging in good faith negotiations or respecting multilateral mechanisms, Beijing continues to act as if might make right, disregarding the concerns and rights of its neighbors. This approach erodes trust, fuels an arms race, and makes peaceful resolution increasingly difficult. China's disregard for diplomatic agreements is well documented. In 2012, when the United States brokered a deal for both Chinese and Philippine vessels to withdraw from Scarborough Shoal, Beijing reneged on the agreement, refused to leave, and began militarizing the area. Since then, China has constructed structures on disputed features, deployed more vessels, and steadily increased its control despite repeated protests from Manila and international condemnation. Perhaps the most tragic consequence of China's aggression is the impact on ordinary Filipinos. Filipino fishermen, who have relied on the rich waters of Scarborough Shoal for generations, now face harassment, water cannon attacks, and the constant threat of violence. These actions are not just violations of sovereignty, they are attacks on the dignity and livelihoods of vulnerable communities. China's latest use of water cannons against a Philippine vessel is not just another maritime incident, it is a stark reminder of Beijing's willingness to flout international law, bully its neighbors, and destabilize the region for its own gain. The international community must not remain silent. It is imperative that nations stand with the Philippines in defending the rule of law, upholding the 2016 arbitral ruling, and demanding that China respect the rights and sovereignty of its neighbors. Anything less will embolden further aggression and set a dangerous precedent for the future of global order. China's actions at Scarborough Shoal are indefensible, unjustifiable, and must be condemned in the strongest possible terms. The world cannot allow might to triumph over right in the South China Sea. The ongoing aggression by China in the South China Sea, particularly at Scarborough Shoal, highlights a blatant disregard for international norms and legal frameworks. The repeated harassment of Philippine vessels through the use of water cannons, dangerous maneuvers, and intimidation tactics not only threatens regional peace and security but also undermines the rules-based international order. The 2016 Arbitral Tribunal ruling under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, clearly invalidated China's expansive claims, affirming the Philippines' sovereign rights within its exclusive economic zone, EEZ. Yet, Beijing continues to dismiss this ruling outright, choosing force over diplomacy. This crisis is not just a Philippine issue, it is a global concern. If the international community allows these acts of aggression to go unchallenged, it sends a message that international law can be ignored with impunity. Regional powers, ASEAN nations, and global stakeholders like the United States, Japan, and the European Union must come together in solidarity. Concrete diplomatic, economic, and strategic responses are needed to deter further escalation. The future of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific depends on the world's collective resolve to stand against coercion and uphold the principle that maritime disputes must be settled lawfully, not by brute force.